Hey everybody, this is Perch. We started off Marvel's Blood Hunt event. The very first issue has come out. Actually, I don't think it's on the streets yet, but I've read the comic, both the normal and the bloody version. And I do fear a little bit. My prediction is that the bloody version, or the red band version, as they're calling it, will be popular. That I think it's going to sell well, and I think as a gimmick it will do well. And I think that, if you're Marvel, you have to be looking at this and going, hey, it's not that expensive to get a couple panels redrawn, basically the exact same comic, but there will be, maybe 5, 10 panels that are just more bloody, or maybe we can even do stuff with the coloring to make it appear more bloody, but it's actually, the same initial line art. And, we could charge an extra dollar for it. People will buy both books. It's kind of a gimmick. It's a little bit like what horror movies did in the 90s. If you remember when they were trying to kind of portray the R rating or the PG-13 rating, and it was like, ooh, this is something your parents wouldn't want you to see. It's got extra blood in it. And they even did this thing, if you remember, for kind of a brief window where they re-released the movie with an extra scene, a couple of extra scenes. Now we're putting the movie out again, except it's got more blood than it did before. And it was kind of a cheap gimmick to get people to come back and buy the movie, buy a ticket again, basically, to see the film. That's a little bit what this feels like. But the challenge that I have with Blood Hunt is, it's another event. It's going to be about 40, 50 odd books. When all is said and done, they count the books strange, by the way, and any collector will tell you that if you're going to put on an event, and the event is going to have things like, a special edition for, like a guide, like a who's who. That's a DC thing, but just like a guide to the event. Hardcore collectors will buy that as well. But a lot of the counts of these comics, they often don't. They don't count it. They're like, well, that's not technically part of the series. It's like, yeah, but you're only putting it out because of this event, so it is part of the event, and completists will buy it, even though they don't. It doesn't really matter to the story. You could say that's cheating all you want, but I mean, you put this book out, so who's fooling who here? That's just kind of, it's a big event. Put it this way, it's a big summer event. It's vampires. And the premise of this is basically for basic reasons. Dark Force users explode. Their Dark Force goo goes up into space and it blocks out the sun. And then now the vampires run amok and immediately start just murdering the shit out of everything. And the heroes have to figure out how to survive this. And at least in the first issue, and we'll see if the series takes on a more serious tone, but I tend to doubt that it will. It's undermined by two things. One, the characters are not really under any threat of dying, and who's kidding who a little bit here. We know that for example, Doctor Strange is not really going to be murdered forever and dead. They're not. He's got a solo book going on, and it has a couple of tie-ins. And Jed MacKay's writing that, just like he's writing the event itself. But we know that this book is not going to end with the death of Doctor Strange due to blood on vampires. So therefore, we know he's coming back to life. And recently, what I've seen is that the publishers, the publishers know that we know, and so they're starting to use language like, well, it doesn't matter if he's pretend dead. The real journey, the real mystery is going to be how we bring him back to life. And I think the problem with that is we've seen enough of those events too, of how they do bring people back to life. And it's usually some kind of silly bullshittery that doesn't feel particularly meaningful. I no knock on anyone else, but I mean, you had the, for example, the Wonder Woman dying in Dark Crisis, Dark Metal. Anyway, that one. And, she gets brought back. And but none of it feels particularly rewarding. The challenge is, when comic deaths stop mattering. I mean, you're talking about like they brought Bucky back, they brought Jean Grey back. Yeah, they did, but a lot of time passed with them staying dead. and a lot of stories and a lot of processing and a lot of material involved in the death existed. And so it's not like they just, were brought back 2 issues later in the same event. Bucky went many decades dead, and then the return was heavily, heavily planned by Brubaker with everything that he put together around the Winter Soldier. So much so that they were, cheerfully able to make a movie out of it. But it wasn't casual. Him coming back to life was not something that was done, instantly. If you contrast that with Bucky dying, being impaled, I don't usually like the word literally because I use it in comics too much. In Fear Itself. Do you remember Bucky being killed in Fear Itself? He was. And he was brought back literally the issue after that event ended. And his return to life was completely ludicrous. It was, and he wasn't really actually dead. Yes, we saw him get completely, impaled, but, that's fine. It happens. It's a flesh wound. And so I think that the problem with Blood Hunt is it's really predicated on the idea of this is deadly. Some heroes are going to bite it. They're going to turn into vampires. Now, you also have the thing where the heroes turn into vampires and run around as vampires, and then you kill the source vampire, and they all magically return to being regular again. You have that as an option. But in some of these, for example, in Blood Hunt #1, Doctor Strange is not just, turned into a vampire. He is probably, conceivably, based on where it looks like it's going. But he also, there's guts flying around everywhere. That's not how the lore of vampirism works. You can create to say we're going to actually cut this person in half, and their intestines are going to get splattered all over the floor, and then somehow that's going to make them a vampire. But then if you kill the source, I'm sorry, I don't think that's a little bit more than a casual wound. So does anyone really buy the premise? And that's a challenge of this thing. You're going to go 40 issues, plus of a crossover. Now you can look at this as just good summer fun. It doesn't need to be thought through much more than just they're vampires. Vampires are running amok, killing things and biting people, and heroes have to save the day and stop it. You can make it it can be that easy, and that's ultimately that's how a lot of us are going to have to look at Blood Hunt as something that is, it's not meant to really be thought through, kind of like King in Black. Big goo monster comes down, terrorizes New York, turns people into goo monsters. Ultimately, heroes stop major goo monster, and, New York goes back to normal. The poor cleaning crew has to go around the street sweeping goo off everything, but other than that, they've done that before. Times Square used to be pretty dirty. But that's just... that's the problem with this event, is you either have to think about it like, stupid fun that really doesn't matter, or you have to suspend your disbelief and accept that, the premise itself is, reasonably ludicrous. And I think that's not the best place to be in if your goal is to, really crank out the events and the tie-ins and everything else and milk as much money out of this as possible. I think that puts you in a tough spot because, you're really hoping to make a lot of money by selling all 40 of those books. Granted, you're aware that some of your customers are only going to buy the first 5 issues of Blood Hunt and be done with it. But really, the reason why you do events is the crossover effect. This is what worked so well for Civil War. They put out the 7 events of Civil War, but the tie-ins also sold off the charts, and so the whole company rose. In this event, I quite frankly, I think it has a potential to do harm, this style of event, because we've seen it from the numbers do harm when it was Empire, when it was King in Black, some of the more recent ones, because they don't make a lot of sense. And so therefore you just have to kind of ignore it. And it does pretty severe damage to comics like Fantastic Four, for example. I'm not loving this book, but a lot of you are. And I get that for whatever reason, it's seen as a pretty genius book. And that's awesome. I'm glad you're liking it. And that's good news for everyone. Well, at least good news for Marvel. But the problem is, if you are a fan of the Ryan North, I always think Peter North, who was a very, very different individual who created very different things. But anyway, if you're a Ryan North fan and you're liking Fantastic Four and you're liking the vibe of this thing, are you really going to enjoy 2 crossover issues into Blood Hunt, where the Fantastic Four have to fight vampires and presumably one of them turns into a vampire himself? Or maybe not. Who knows? I would think the sucker thing that they would do is make Ben Grimm the Thing into a vampire, because then it will be like, oh, he's a super strong rock monster, but now he's a vampire super strong rock monster. Like, oh, shit, what's going to happen now? I hope they resist that temptation, but, who knows? But again, Peter David made this point years and years ago when he's forced to pull in X Factor into a bunch of events, and he's like, I get a good story going, and then suddenly have to change the entire tone and cross over into all this, and the readers who are along for the ride get kind of screwed in that deal, because they're basically forced to go in on an event they didn't want in the first place. And that's the problem with these things. So if you combine that, the potential of this, may, quite frankly, derail comics that were, on track and doing quite well on their own. And it's, perceived as kind of just summer silliness where, we don't really have to worry about the stakes or the consequences. And that combo, I think, does a lot of harm. And so that, it's pretty. Pepe Larraz's art looks great. Jed MacKay is trying his heart out to, tell his stories and everything else. But at the end of the day, you're also talking about a guy who's writing Doctor Strange, writing Moon Knight, writing Blood Hunt, writing the Avengers, and writing now one of the X-Men books. You do have to wonder at some point, like, what the hell? Like, who in the world is letting Jed MacKay do all this stuff? And does everyone really think that this is going to not have consequences to the quality of his writing? I mean, it is impossible for it not to. And so if you have a guy who's actually starting to build some franchises, I mean, he has put Moon Knight on the map as a book that is getting some regular reads. His Doctor Strange hasn't clicked as much as his Moon Knight has. He's off to try to do an Avengers run that, seemed to be going to Donny Cates once upon a time, but, we all know how that worked out. So now he's over here, and he's relaunching an X-Men book. I don't know. This feels like a bad idea, but what do I know? I'm just some guy. Sorry, that's a different video. Go away now. That feels better. Thanks for listening.